The wealthiest people in the room thought they were the most important people in the building, until a nurse refused to walk away from a patient who needed her help. Sometimes the difference between doing what is easy and doing what is right changes everything. Thank you for supporting our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing meaningful and inspiring stories. If you enjoy stories about courage, compassion, and unexpected moments of recognition, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you more unforgettable experiences in the future. The lobby of Whitmore Regional Medical Center had been transformed into something closer to a luxury event than a hospital entrance. Fresh flowers lined the reception area. Executives adjusted their suits. Public relations staff moved quickly from one conversation to another. A group of important investors was arriving for a private tour, and CEO Jonathan Whitmore intended to make certain everything looked perfect. Every employee had received instructions earlier that morning. Hallways were to remain clear. Waiting areas were to remain orderly. No disruptions. No surprises. No exceptions. Savannah Parker had heard those instructions like everyone else. She simply had different priorities. Near the edge of the lobby, an elderly man sat quietly in a wheelchair. Most people passed him without a second glance. He wore a faded jacket and carried a small duffel bag resting beside him. His posture suggested discomfort, but he never complained. He simply waited. Savannah noticed him immediately. She always noticed the people others overlooked. While executives prepared for the investor visit, she approached the man and knelt beside him. "Sir, are you doing all right?" she asked. The man attempted a smile. "I will be fine." Savannah had heard that answer hundreds of times. Usually it meant the opposite. She checked on him briefly and became concerned. The man appeared increasingly uncomfortable, and she knew he should not be left alone. At that exact moment, movement near the entrance signaled the arrival of the investors. Cameras appeared. Handshakes followed. Jonathan Whitmore greeted each guest personally. The atmosphere changed instantly. Conversations stopped as attention shifted toward the visitors. Savannah remained focused on the patient. The elderly man suddenly struggled to remain comfortable in his chair. Without hesitation, she stayed beside him. One of the public relations managers hurried over. "Savannah, we need the area clear." Savannah glanced up. "This patient needs assistance. The tour is starting." "Then the tour can wait a minute." The manager looked horrified by the response and quickly disappeared toward the executives. Less than 60 seconds later, Jonathan Whitmore himself approached. Several investors followed behind him. The CEO's expression darkened when he saw a nurse kneeling beside a patient directly along the carefully planned tour route. "Back away, nurse," he said sharply. The lobby became silent. Employees froze. Visitors exchanged uncertain looks. Savannah slowly stood but did not leave the patient's side. "He needs help," she said calmly. Jonathan glanced toward the investors. "Move him elsewhere." Savannah shook her head. "Right now he needs medical attention." The CEO's face tightened. Nobody had ever challenged him publicly during an investor presentation. Around them, dozens of people watched the confrontation unfold. Then something unexpected happened. Standing among the visitors was a man whose attention had shifted completely away from the investors and onto the elderly patient. The moment he saw the older man's face, his expression changed. And as Savannah continued standing beside the patient despite the pressure surrounding her, the stranger quietly reached for his phone. 6 hours earlier, Whitmore Regional Medical Center looked nothing like the polished showcase it would later become. The lobby was crowded with patients, families, delivery workers, and hospital staff moving through another demanding day. Savannah Parker arrived 15 minutes before her shift, just as she always did. She carried a coffee in one hand and a small notebook in the other. Several nurses greeted her as she entered. A few patients recognized her by name. She smiled politely and continued toward the emergency department. Savannah had worked at the hospital for nearly 4 years. During that time, she had earned a reputation that rarely appeared in performance reports but was well known among patients and frontline staff. Whenever a difficult situation appeared, people looked for Savannah. Whenever a frightened family needed reassurance, people called Savannah. Whenever a patient seemed forgotten, Savannah somehow noticed. What made her unusual was not extraordinary skill or dramatic confidence. It was her refusal to stop caring even when everyone else became too busy. That morning began like dozens before it. She checked charts, reviewed overnight notes, and helped a new nurse navigate hospital software that never seemed to cooperate with anyone. She delivered blankets, answered questions, and spent extra time with an anxious elderly woman awaiting test results. Several times co-workers reminded her to take a break. Several times she forgot. By late morning, the hospital was buzzing with a different kind of energy. Administrators appeared throughout the building. Maintenance crews polished already clean surfaces. Fresh floral arrangements arrived. Public relations employees walked hallways carrying clipboards and schedules. The reason quickly became obvious. A group of major investors would be touring the hospital later that afternoon. The visit had been discussed for weeks. According to management, future expansion projects depended on making a strong impression. Savannah listened to the announcements while organizing supplies. None of it interested her very much. Hospitals existed to care for people. Everything else seemed secondary. Around noon, she overheard two administrators discussing preparations. "The CEO wants everything perfect," one said. "No delays. No confusion. No problems." The other nodded. "Especially in public areas." Savannah returned her attention to her work. Patients rarely adjusted their needs to fit public relations schedules. Shortly afterward, she entered the emergency waiting area to check on several individuals whose evaluations were still pending. That was when she noticed an elderly man sitting alone near the far wall. Most people walked past him without a second glance. He wore a faded jacket and carried an old duffel bag that looked as though it had traveled many miles. His posture immediately concerned her. Something about the way he sat suggested he was trying very hard not to draw attention to himself. Savannah approached and introduced herself. The man looked up with tired eyes and offered a polite smile. "I am fine," he said before she even asked. The answer sounded rehearsed. Savannah smiled gently. "Maybe, but I would still like to check on you." The man hesitated before agreeing. As she began asking simple questions, she noticed something else. Despite his humble appearance, he carried himself with unusual discipline. Every movement seemed deliberate. Every answer was measured. And when he looked at her face, there was a brief moment where something in his expression changed, as if he thought he recognized her from somewhere long ago. The elderly man introduced himself simply as Walter Hayes. He answered Savannah's questions politely and never complained, even when she encouraged him to describe how he was feeling. Something about him stood out. It was not his clothing or his age. It was the way he observed everything around him. He seemed to notice details that most people missed. After checking his vital signs, Savannah became concerned that he should not remain in the waiting area much longer. She updated his information and promised she would return shortly. Walter thanked her and watched as she moved across the department helping other patients. Throughout the afternoon, preparations for the investor visit intensified. Hospital administrators moved through hallways with growing urgency. Fresh signs appeared. Waiting areas were rearranged. Employees received repeated reminders about professionalism and appearance. CEO Jonathan Whitmore personally reviewed the schedule several times. The investors represented millions of dollars in potential funding, and he intended to make sure the hospital presented itself perfectly. During a planning meeting, one executive mentioned that patient traffic in the lobby could create challenges. Jonathan immediately instructed managers to keep public areas as orderly as possible. No disruptions, no confusion, no scenes that might distract from the presentation. Meanwhile, Savannah remained focused on patients rather than presentations. She checked on Walter twice more during the afternoon. Each time she found him sitting quietly, observing the activity around him. During her second visit, he surprised her with a question. "How long have you worked here?" Savannah smiled. "Almost 4 years." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "And before that?" Savannah laughed softly. "That sounds like a very long story." "Sometimes long stories are the important ones." She shrugged. "I suppose so." Before she could continue, another patient required assistance. Savannah apologized and hurried away. Walter watched her leave. The feeling that he recognized her continued growing stronger. He could not explain it yet. He simply knew there was something familiar about her calm voice, her confidence under pressure, and her habit of putting other people first. Later that afternoon, Jonathan Whitmore gathered department supervisors for a final briefing before the investors arrived. Expectations were clear. Every employee was expected to support the event. Any situation that could create an unfavorable impression needed to be addressed immediately. Several supervisors nodded. Others appeared nervous. Savannah happened to overhear part of the conversation while delivering paperwork. She quietly returned to her duties. To her, the most important people in the building were still the patients. As the hours passed, Walter's condition appeared increasingly concerning. Savannah noticed subtle changes that reinforced her belief that he required closer attention. She began making arrangements to have him evaluated more quickly. At nearly the same moment, luxury vehicles started arriving outside the hospital entrance. The investors had arrived. Executives moved into position. Public relations staff prepared cameras and welcome materials. The carefully planned tour was about to begin. Standing near the waiting area, Walter looked toward Savannah one more time. Then he noticed something resting partially visible beneath the sleeve of her uniform. A small emblem he had not seen in years. His eyes widened slightly. Suddenly, the memory returned. And in that instant, he realized exactly where he had seen Savannah Parker before. The investors entered Whitmore Regional Medical Center surrounded by executives, photographers, and administrators eager to impress them. Jonathan Whitmore walked confidently at the front of the group, shaking hands and pointing out recent renovations. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. At least that was what he believed. A short distance away, Savannah Parker remained focused on Walter Hayes. The elderly veteran appeared increasingly uncomfortable, and every instinct told her that he needed immediate attention. While executives discussed future expansion projects, Savannah was paying attention to something far more important. She checked on Walter again and noticed subtle changes that concerned her even more than before. "I would like to bring you to an examination area," she said gently. Walter looked at her for a moment and nodded. "You always were the one who noticed first." Savannah paused. "I am sorry." Walter smiled faintly. "Nothing." Before she could ask another question, a public relations manager rushed toward her. "Savannah, not now." Savannah frowned. "This patient needs help. The investor tour is coming through here." Savannah looked at Walter and then back at the manager. "Then they can walk around us." The manager stared at her in disbelief and hurried away. Minutes later, the investor group approached. Jonathan Whitmore led them directly through the lobby. The polished presentation immediately slowed when he noticed Savannah beside Walter's wheelchair. Several investors turned their attention toward the scene. Jonathan's expression tightened. This was exactly the kind of disruption he had wanted to avoid. He walked over with controlled frustration. "What is happening here?" Savannah remained calm. "This patient requires medical evaluation." Jonathan glanced toward the visitors. "Move him to another area." "I am trying to." "Then do it later." Savannah looked directly at him. "Later is not the best option." Several people nearby exchanged nervous looks. Challenging the CEO publicly was not something employees normally did. Jonathan lowered his voice, though the irritation remained obvious. "Today is important for this hospital." Savannah answered without hesitation. "Every day is important for the people who come here for help." The words landed heavily. Some employees quietly looked away. Others watched with growing admiration. Walter remained silent throughout the exchange, carefully observing everyone involved. One investor standing near the back of the group suddenly recognized him. His eyes widened. He leaned closer for a better look and then immediately reached for his phone. Meanwhile, Jonathan's patience was running out. "You are creating a problem." Savannah shook her head. "No, sir. I am trying to solve one." The lobby became completely silent. Even the investors stopped talking. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Walter looked up at Savannah and spoke softly enough that only a few people nearby could hear. "You have not changed at all." Savannah looked confused. Before she could respond, the investor who had made the phone call stepped away from the group and quietly said 4 words into the receiver. "We found Savannah Parker." The person on the other end did not ask who she was. Instead, the reply came instantly. "We are coming now." The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. Savannah Parker remained beside Walter Hayes while executives, investors, and hospital staff tried to understand what had just happened. The investor who had placed the phone call lowered his device and stepped back into the group without offering any explanation. Jonathan Whitmore immediately noticed. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The investor hesitated. "No, not exactly." Jonathan frowned. The answer only increased his frustration. This tour was supposed to be controlled, predictable, and flawless. Instead, attention had shifted away from expansion plans and financial projections and toward a nurse and an elderly patient sitting in the middle of the lobby. Savannah ignored the growing tension around her and focused on Walter. "I would like to move you to an examination room now," she said gently. Walter nodded. "That sounds like a good idea." Before she could begin, Jonathan stepped forward again. "This discussion is not finished." Savannah looked at him calmly. "A patient comes first." Several employees exchanged nervous glances. Nobody spoke. Walter watched the interaction carefully. There was no anger in his expression, only quiet observation. He had seen situations like this before. Different people, different places, the same choice. Someone prioritizing appearances while someone else prioritized people. As Savannah began guiding Walter toward a nearby treatment area, Jonathan turned to the department manager. "I want a full report regarding this situation before the end of the day." The manager nodded immediately. Everyone understood what that meant. Savannah understood as well. Yet she never slowed down. 20 minutes later, Walter was resting comfortably in a private examination room. His condition was stable, and he appeared far more relaxed than before. Savannah reviewed several notes before preparing to leave. "Thank you," Walter said. Savannah smiled. "That is what I am here for." Walter studied her face. "No, not everyone would have done what you did today." Savannah shrugged. "Most people would." Walter smiled knowingly. "You still believe that?" Before she could ask what he meant, her pager sounded. Another patient needed assistance. Savannah apologized and left the room. The moment the door closed, Walter reached for his phone. This time he was not calling an investor. He was calling someone else entirely. The line connected after a single ring. "Did you find her?" a voice asked immediately. Walter smiled. "Yes." "Are you certain?" "More certain than I have been about anything in years." There was a long pause on the other end. Then came the question Walter had expected. Is she really the same person? Walter looked toward the hallway where Savannah had disappeared moments earlier. She is exactly the same person. Several states away, inside a conference room filled with photographs, records, and memorabilia from years of service, a man slowly stood from his chair. Commander Daniel Mercer listened carefully as Walter described everything he had witnessed. When the call ended, nobody in the room spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel smiled. "Prepare the vehicles." One of the men nearby looked surprised. "Tonight." Daniel nodded without hesitation. "Tonight." Back at Whitmore Regional Medical Center, Savannah continued her shift completely unaware that hundreds of miles away, people who had spent years searching for her had just received the news they never expected to hear. The remainder of the evening passed quietly inside Whitmore Regional Medical Center, but beneath the surface something had changed. Savannah Parker continued moving from patient to patient, unaware that events far beyond the hospital walls had already been set into motion. She updated charts, assisted physicians, comforted worried families, and completed every task expected of her. To everyone around her, it appeared to be an ordinary shift. Yet several people could not stop thinking about what had happened earlier. The investor who had recognized Walter Hayes remained unusually distracted throughout the remainder of the tour. Jonathan Whitmore noticed it immediately. During presentations about future expansion projects and financial performance, the investor repeatedly glanced toward the emergency department. Finally, Jonathan approached him during a brief break. "You seem preoccupied," he said. The investor smiled politely. "Just thinking." "About what?" Jonathan asked. The man hesitated. "About the nurse." Jonathan's expression hardened slightly. "Savannah Parker?" "Yes." Jonathan folded his arms. "What about her?" The investor looked toward the hallway leading to patient care areas. Sometimes the most valuable person in a building is not the one standing at the front giving presentations. The answer lingered in Jonathan's mind long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Walter rested comfortably in his room. Several nurses checked on him throughout the evening, but he seemed unusually cheerful. Each time Savannah entered, he watched her with growing admiration. Finally, during one visit, he asked a question. "Have you ever wondered if people remember the things you do?" Savannah laughed softly. "Not really." Walter smiled. "That sounds exactly like something you would say." Savannah shook her head. "You keep saying things like that." Walter leaned back comfortably. "Because I know more than you think." Before she could ask another question, another patient needed assistance. Once again, Savannah excused herself and hurried away. Walter watched her disappear into the hallway and smiled to himself. Several hours later, darkness settled across the city. Outside the hospital, traffic thinned and parking lots became quieter. Inside, however, activity continued around the clock. Near midnight, a security officer standing near the front entrance noticed several dark vehicles entering hospital property. The vehicles moved calmly but purposefully. There was nothing alarming about them, yet their arrival immediately attracted attention. They parked near the main entrance, and several individuals stepped out. Their appearance was professional and disciplined. They were clearly not patients or ordinary visitors. One of the security officers approached politely. "Can I help you?" The man at the front offered a respectful nod. "We are looking for someone." "Who?" the officer asked. The man smiled faintly. "Savannah Parker." At nearly the same moment, inside the emergency department, Savannah finished updating a patient chart and looked up as a strange feeling settled over her. She could not explain it. It felt almost as though something long forgotten was about to return. Across the building, Walter glanced toward the window and saw the vehicles arriving. His smile widened. "Right on time," he whispered. Inside the hospital, curiosity spread faster than any announcement. Security officers escorted the visitors through the lobby, but it quickly became obvious that these were not ordinary guests. Their calm professionalism and quiet confidence drew attention everywhere they went. Nurses looked up from computer stations. Administrators paused conversations. Even patients in waiting areas noticed something unusual was happening. Leading the group was Commander Daniel Mercer. His hair carried traces of gray now, but his posture remained unmistakably disciplined. He thanked the security officer and continued toward the emergency department. "She is working tonight?" he asked. "Yes," the officer replied. "She is in the treatment area." Daniel smiled faintly. "That sounds like her." Moments later, Savannah Parker emerged from a patient room carrying a chart. She was reviewing notes when she heard someone speak her name. Not Nurse Parker. Not Miss Parker. Her full name. Savannah Parker. She stopped walking. The voice sounded familiar, though she could not immediately place it. When she looked up, Daniel Mercer was standing a few yards away. For several seconds, neither moved. The busy emergency department seemed to fade into the background. Savannah stared at him in disbelief. "Daniel?" she asked quietly. The commander smiled. "Good to see you again." Several nurses exchanged confused glances. The fact that someone of his stature knew Savannah personally was surprising enough. The expression on Savannah's face made it even more mysterious. She almost never looked shocked. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Daniel laughed softly. "That is an interesting question coming from someone who disappeared." Nearby, Walter Hayes had been transported closer to the emergency department for observation. The moment he saw Daniel, he smiled. "Took you long enough." Daniel shook his head. "Traffic." A few people laughed. Others remained completely confused. Jonathan Whitmore had already been informed about the visitors and arrived moments later accompanied by several executives. The CEO approached with professional confidence. "Good evening. I am Jonathan Whitmore." Daniel shook his hand politely. "Commander Daniel Mercer." Jonathan's expression shifted slightly. He recognized the name immediately. "What brings you to our hospital?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Savannah Parker." The surrounding staff fell silent. Jonathan glanced toward Savannah and then back toward Daniel. "I was not aware she was expecting visitors." Daniel smiled. "She was not." Savannah folded her arms. "You still have not answered my question." Daniel looked around at the growing crowd of employees gathering nearby. "Because the answer is longer than you think." He reached into a folder and removed an old photograph. Then another. Then another. Several images showed groups of men and women standing together years earlier. In every photograph, Savannah appeared somewhere in the background, never in the center, never seeking attention, always helping someone else. A nurse standing nearby looked at the photographs in amazement. "That is you." Savannah sighed. "A long time ago." Daniel looked toward the crowd. "Not long enough to forget." The room became completely silent as he held up one photograph and said the words nobody expected to hear. "Most of you know Savannah as a nurse. What you do not know is that many of us spent years searching for the woman who changed more lives than she ever allowed anyone to talk about." For a moment, nobody spoke. The emergency department stood completely still as employees, patients, administrators, and visitors stared at the photographs in Daniel Mercer's hands. Savannah Parker looked as though she wanted the floor to open beneath her. Attention had never been something she enjoyed. Recognition was something she actively avoided. Yet there was no avoiding it now. Daniel placed several photographs on a nearby counter where everyone could see them. Each image showed Savannah years earlier standing beside groups of professionals in difficult environments. In every photograph, she appeared exactly the same way she did today. Calm, focused, unconcerned with herself, focused entirely on helping others. Jonathan Whitmore stepped closer. I do not understand, he admitted. Daniel nodded. Most people here do not. He picked up one photograph and smiled. That is because Savannah never talks about herself. Walter Hayes laughed softly from his nearby bed. That is the understatement of the century. Several people smiled. Savannah covered her face briefly and shook her head. Daniel continued. Years ago, many people worked alongside Savannah during some of the most demanding assignments of their careers. Different locations, different challenges, different teams. Yet the stories were always the same. He looked around the room. Whenever someone needed help, Savannah was there. A nurse standing nearby crossed her arms. That sounds exactly like her. Several co-workers nodded in agreement. Daniel smiled. Exactly. He removed a small bundle of letters from his folder. The paper showed signs of age. Some envelopes had clearly traveled thousands of miles before arriving there. These were written by people who hoped they might someday find her again. Savannah stared at the letters in disbelief. You kept those? Daniel looked genuinely surprised by the question. Of course we did. He handed them to her. People wanted you to know what your kindness meant to them. Savannah carefully accepted the bundle. As she read the first page, emotion appeared in her eyes. One letter described a difficult period in someone's life and the encouragement that helped them continue forward. Another thanked her for treating people with dignity when they felt invisible. Another simply said that a family never forgot her compassion. Around the room, silence deepened. Even Jonathan Whitmore seemed unable to look away. Daniel waited until Savannah finished reading before speaking again. Do you know why Walter recognized you? Savannah looked up. Walter answered first. Because you said the same thing. She frowned. What thing? Walter smiled. Earlier today, when everyone else was focused on schedules, appearances, and presentations, you looked at a patient and said, "Let me help." Daniel nodded. That is how people remembered you. Not because of a title, not because of a position, because no matter where you were, helping people always came first. Several employees lowered their eyes. Others smiled proudly. The same nurse they had worked beside for years suddenly seemed different, yet somehow exactly the same. Daniel glanced around the room one final time. The reason we came here tonight is simple. Too many people owed Savannah Parker a thank you. And after years of searching, we finally have the chance to say it in person. For several moments, nobody spoke. The emergency department remained completely silent as Savannah Parker stood holding the letters that had traveled across years and countless miles to reach her. Around her, nurses, physicians, administrators, patients, and visitors all seemed to be seeing her for the first time. Yet Savannah herself had not changed. She was still the same woman who had walked into work that morning expecting nothing more than an ordinary shift. Commander Daniel Mercer looked around the room and smiled. There is one final thing we came here to do. He stepped aside and several members of his group moved forward. One by one, they shook Savannah's hand. Some thanked her quietly. Others simply smiled. Every gesture carried the same message. Respect, gratitude, recognition. Walter Hayes watched the scene with satisfaction. I told you they would find you eventually. Savannah laughed softly through her emotion. I was hoping they would not. The room filled with gentle laughter. Daniel shook his head. That is exactly why everyone wanted to find you. Nearby, Jonathan Whitmore stood unusually still. Throughout his career, he had spent years evaluating people based on resumes, titles, performance reports, and executive recommendations. Yet the woman standing before him had earned something far more valuable. Genuine respect from people who had no reason to offer it unless it had been earned. After a long pause, he stepped forward. Every eye in the room followed him. Savannah, he said quietly. The use of her first name immediately caught everyone's attention. I owe you an apology. Savannah looked at him calmly. Jonathan took a breath. Today I was focused on investors, presentations, and appearances. You were focused on a patient. Looking back, I believe you understood the purpose of this hospital better than I did. The honesty surprised everyone. Jonathan continued. You reminded all of us why this place exists. Savannah smiled gently. Everyone has difficult days. Jonathan shook his head. Perhaps, but not everyone responds to them the way you did. For the first time all evening, the CEO seemed genuinely humbled. Several employees exchanged approving glances. The moment felt sincere. Daniel looked around the department and addressed everyone present. The reason Savannah earned respect was never because of where she worked before. It was because wherever she went, she put people first. Walter nodded. She still does. The statement drew smiles from across the room. A few nurses wiped away tears. Others laughed quietly. The tension that had dominated the day was completely gone. In its place stood something much stronger. Appreciation. As the hour grew late, people slowly returned to their responsibilities. Patients still needed care. Phones still rang. The hospital continued operating. Yet something had changed. Employees who had overlooked Savannah now understood her value. Administrators who had barely noticed her now respected her. And Savannah herself finally understood that the kindness she gave so freely had never been forgotten. Before leaving,